This is In Touch with Terry, a power-packed podcast for the medical aesthetics industry.
I just discovered your podcast, and I feel like I've hit a gold mine.
This is someone who's got a lot of knowledge. She's been there, done that.
Terry Ross is a former Fortune 500 executive, international speaker, founder and co-CEO of Apex Platform, and Terry Ross Consulting.
Just listening to her energy and her passion and just how hardcore she is.
Her knowledge of the industry and just her connections in general are phenomenal.
In Touch with Terry will bring you solutions to increase operational and employee efficiency and practice profitability. Plus, features some of the top industry experts as guests.
The Apex team literally changed the game for us.
Terry, your courses and your podcast are just so helpful.
She made me feel like I could do this.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Now, here's Terry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to In Touch with Terry, where this podcast is all about having experts and giving you real valuable information. I am very thrilled today to be joined by my great friends, close friends, colleagues, Michael Byrd and ByrdAdatto, partners and owners of ByrdAdatto Law Firm, which is probably one of the best law firms in the aesthetic space. I'm sure most of my listeners and my tribe know them well, but I wanted to have them on because they are, again, experts in this industry. And there's such a hot topic going on right now. And for those of you that are part of their firm and or part of AmSpa, what we're seeing is about 50% of people attending these AmSpa conferences are looking to get into the medical aesthetic space. And I wanted this podcast to be really focused on the life cycle of what it takes to really start an aesthetic practice and then moving toward down that chain into the exit. So Michael and Brad, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Yeah, we're pumped to be here with you, Terry. It's always nice to be invited back. I guess we did okay the first time.
Well, that's why I asked you back. Obviously I could go on about you, but for those of you that don't know Michael and Brad or ByrdAdatto Law Firm, please, I'd love for you to just share a few words about your firm and what you guys do and specialize in.
Sure. So again, thank you for having us on, and I'm just going to carry you around with me to introduce me with the kind words that you had at the beginning. ByrdAdatto is a business and healthcare law firm. 100% of what we do is business transactional law. About 75% of our clients are in the healthcare space, and over half of those are in medical aesthetics. And so this is what we do. My dad's a plastic surgeon. I've been doing this since the beginning. Brad's dad's a physician, and so he has a rich background both in that and in orthopedics and aesthetics, and so we are 14 lawyers now.
Yep,
and clients in
coast to coast.
Yep.
Congrats. That's obviously, again, such speaks to your credibility and your credentials. I don't really know many other firms that do it as well as you do. Brad, anything to add with that?
No, I mean, I think the most important thing to remember is that just because Michael's name's first does not make him better than me. So I think that's probably really important.
Now that you say that, Brad, I do think that maybe that is an indicator.
No, not at all.
Well, I think it's good that you guys clarified that, because I'm sure when the listeners want to contact you, it might be this fighting war. Brad, Michael.
Brad. But well, yes, thank you again. I think the most important thing, as Michael said, is this is an area that's been rich for us. I think, as we've known before, I think this is my 25th year practicing law. This is Michael's 250th year practicing law. And for us, it's literally been our entire career has been in the healthcare field. So this is not something new that we said, oh, this sounds like a really cool place to show up and practice. It's who we are. It's what we've done. And so, and as Michael has said, his dad being a plastic surgeon, some of his first clients of all were in the aesthetic industry because they're plastic surgeons. So it's an area that he's known his entire career also.
Well, thank you so much. Again, lends to the credibility. So what I'd like to do is start off, and Brad, it was great to see you at ASAPS. And I know one of the biggest hot topics right now that we'll get to at the end. So stay with me, guys. Get out a pen and paper. This is going to be very valuable information. And really, for those of you that are thinking about starting a med spa, attending an AmSpa boot camp, thinking you can do it on your own, I really want you to take note of this podcast because it's critical, and there's some vital things, again, both with legal and compliance, and then on the setting up and the infrastructure that is going to be really important to you. So when we think about how many people want to get into the space, what are some of the, I guess, fundamental aspects people should be considering from the legal perspectives that you see when wanting to open up a medical aesthetic practice?
I think the number one thing that everyone must understand as they enter into the aesthetic market, and as Michael and I have said, that word aesthetic or cosmetic means so much to so many different people, but ultimately it's the practice of medicine, no matter what verbiage you're utilizing to describe it. And so as the entrepreneurs who come in here, or your typical providers come in, just remember, just because it's the word non-invasive is thrown around a lot, does not mean it's not medical. And so I think that's the first big takeaway on that piece. I don't know if you have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, and this Brad's message is great, and it applies to everyone, even our board certified plastic surgeons who are out there, because they too fall into some compliance traps because they perceive the surgical side as the practice of medicine and the non-surgical as not, or that tends to be a blind spot that we see that tends to lead to some, inadvertent non-compliance when they're setting up their practice.
And just for clarity for those, right? Practice of medicine, I know what it means in my world and my perspective as a consultant. But when you were talking about that, can you guys elaborate a little bit more? And are you meaning who can provide certain services, how they set up their structure? What does that mean exactly?
Well, so yeah, again, take that step back, Terry, is understand every state defines the practice of medicine a little bit different, but the general rule in almost every state is basically anytime that you're diagnosing or coming up with a treatment plan and or affecting living tissue. So affecting that living tissue could be freezing it. It could be burning it. It could be piercing it, right? All those are different layers in which happens. And again, some states are very specific as to how they describe the practice of medicine versus others. And so that's the first layer that you go through. Once you establish the fact that you are practicing medicine, that then brings in the other elements, as I think, as you said, who can do what, or how does that work from there?
Yeah. And so what we're trying to do, as Brad said, is define what is considered medical. And if you think about kind of in practical terms, a traditional medical spa, about the only thing that's not medical is hydrofacial or traditional spa services, if you have that.
Sure.
But most, like microneedling is considered the practice of medicine in I think almost every state.
Yes.
There's a couple of carve-outs, but it's a really broad term in when you apply it to medical aesthetics.
Yeah. And I think the other big takeaway, again, that we will hear often is, well, what if the patient just says it's not? Mm-hmm. Well, that the patient doesn't get to determine it's not. Mm-hmm. The provider, doesn't get to determine it's not. It either is defined by that state or it isn't. And I think that's what Michael's going with, trying to understand the difference.
So from your perspective, and obviously I'm in California, one of the toughest states out there.
Yes.
I remember having Lasky, for God's sake. I mean, the medical assistant couldn't even put numbing cream on.
Right.
But how are states deciding who can do what?
So here's what I'd like to do is I want to put a pin in that question for a moment and start with the next logical step of if it's medical is the question of who can own the practice. And so we have audience members that may not be doctors. If you're a doctor, you can own your practice. So as long as you're licensed in that particular state that you're wanting to own it. But in many states, the majority of states, there are rules in place that says that if the services are medical, then it has to be doctor owned or doctor owned with some other strings that would allow other professionals or non-doctors to be owners. But, for your business people out there or even your mid-level providers, a lot of times this creates the first dilemma, which is I want to open my medical aesthetic practice, and I'm not allowed to own a medical aesthetic practice in our state. And I know, Brad, you could kind of talk about the MSO model. And
yeah, and to add on to that, as Michael said, this is very state driven. So you may be people panicking because they own it and they may be fine in their state. So just because you threw out the word California is a very strict corporate practice of medicine state. Basically, only physicians and certain allied licensed personnel can co-own it with a physician. There's no other way to get around that particular piece. And then when you start adding in other layers to this, when you really start looking at the ownership model, one of the things is the entrepreneurs are like, well, hey, I'm not a doctor or I'm not a physician. How can I own it? And so that's where the management service organization model comes into play. And so for those who don't know, that's just, again, MSO is just an LLC or an Inc. It's another just entity that licensed to do business in your state. It enters into a contract, often called a management service agreement, where it helps manage and oversee the day-to-day business side, operational side of the medical entity. And that becomes part of the enterprise. Now, that MSO is going to do a lot on behalf of that medical entity. It's going to be ultimately at the end of the day, it's going to make everything possible. So when that doctor or the PA, the nurse practitioner, or the RN shows up, all they have to do is flip that light switch on and provide medical services. And you, the MSO, made that happen. And for that, you should be reimbursed for all your expenses and paid some type of fee. And there's some rules surrounding that piece that we could spend 45 minutes on that alone.
Right.
But conceptually being is you're still building something, you're still owning something. And so don't let the heart palpitations say, oh my gosh, I can't own this. You can, you just have to own it in a different perspective.
Yeah. And it's, especially with what we're trying to cover today, we can't go super deep on it. The takeaway is these are common. We're doing a dozen MSO setups at any one time all around the country. And half of them are for existing businesses that are just realizing they need it. They didn't know it. And so there's a fix to it. And so, it's just one of the steps to compliance. The other is what you just asked about, Terry, which is how do you figure out who can do what? Because that gets into the next kind of fundamental part of the compliance. And
before we jump that, I just want to add one more thing to your audience. Just because Michael and I look like young whippersnappers here with our awesome blue jackets matching our blue curtains, which was not planned, by the way, understand something. MSOs have been around forever. This is not some new term of art that Michael and I just came up with. This is something that's been around 40, 50 years. Hospital systems use them all the time. So people hear it and it's like, and if they're not used to that term, they get kind of panicky again saying, well, who made this up? How does this work? How do the states view it? The states don't really view it in a bad way, mostly. It's just been around forever. It just has to be done compliantly. So I want to
Mike, before we move on, and thank you for catching that you're right. That comes up all the time. Who can own what? And people get very confused with that structure. I'm curious, can people, if they did not retain you or never attend a conference, do people ever try to go do it on their own and get away with it without having the right structure in place?
Well, yes, people try it, and there are attorneys out there that know. I mean, the MSO is there's nothing secret about it.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that, because we do so many of them, we know how to drill down and really make sure the MSA, the arrangement lines up with what they're trying to accomplish. So the big do-it-yourself mistake that happens is you get a form document that is 80% what you need. Like it says all the things you need it to say, and it also says things you're going to do that you don't realize it says, and then you're not doing them. And then when you're investigated, you could actually get in bigger trouble because you're saying, here's our model, and they ask the logical questions, and reality doesn't match what the agreement says.
Yeah. And anyone who's ever heard us speak or listened to our podcast, Terry, they would hear me say right afterwards, the form must match the substance. So those are the two things that have to go, to Michael's point, is people make the mistake. They think they are compliant because they bought or have a management service agreement in place. That is a piece of the compliance. It does not make you compliant.
I love all that. Such good stuff. And the reason you guys look like young whippersnappers, by the way, is because you're in the space. And so all those treatments that you guys are getting, right?
Yeah.
looking fine, looking trim. So, okay, we were starting to move on then. Once we do have some structure in place, and obviously we'll get to the fact that you guys can help clients interested in doing these things. Let's move into then, because I know that there is so much controversy, and clearly we hear it within our company as well, as it relates to who can do what, and then whether they're willing to abide by their state specific laws or not.
Well, especially since we have audiences, the audiences around the country, I think we can talk about it generally about how do states decide who can do what. It shapes a lot. So there's two basic ways states set this up. There's one where they're basically putting it all on the doctor. The medical board says, you're the doctor, you're in charge. You have to delegate to people that you deem have the appropriate level of training, and we're going to hold you to the standard of care. And so if you decide to go delegate Botox to ByrdAdatto, your attorney, then that's your risk. Look at his hands. They're so shaky.
But I inject with this hand, so it's probably good.
Okay, well, that's probably better. And so those states, on the one hand, create a ton of flexibility when you're trying to figure out how to staff it. On the other hand, it creates a lot of responsibility to make sure that you really are navigating your risk, because just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yep. And there can be a lot of problems created. The other way states set up who can do what is they just flat out tell you. Like California says, if you're providing medical services, they can be done by RNs or higher, period. So if you see an esthetician doing something that's considered the practice of medicine, that's not compliant. And there are a lot of states that kind of follow that model where they just tell you what your scope of practice is.
Fun fact, audience, or Terry tribe, California is extremely aggressive on what Michael just said. So if you are in California, we recommend you be obscenely compliant.
Look, most of you guys know I've shared the story before. I remember this was 2014 when I had taken over Lasky, and I think I attended one of the first AmSpa boot camps. We got busted. And it was for an NP who didn't have a license. She did pass the boards. She didn't have it yet. And somebody came in, a couple, and I think that's sort of the story, and I want to talk about that in a minute, came in and act like they wanted to get Botox, and then, we got fined, and it was a whole thing from there. And I think that was when it was really happening. So are you guys still finding that people are doing things not within compliance? Are people being busted for that? And if so, like, what % of the time you think that's happening? Or are they just doing whatever they want?
I can say the first thing is for your audience to understand, generally speaking, the boards in your state, no matter what state you're in, are so dang busy with complaints, then they don't generally just kind of kick down the doors asking for your papers and making sure everybody's right. You're basically going to get reported by an angry person. That's your angry patients, your angry employees, or your angry competitors. And sometimes, as Michael and I both know, angry exes. Mm-hmm. But somebody's who's angry is the first person to report you. Now, then after the boards may investigate you to determine if there's any, there's smoke and fire. And so that's the first thing to understand. So yes, investigations are definitely happening. Yes, Michael and I can both say we've seen an uptick just across the board as far as what we're seeing for either for nurse practitioners or RNs or for PAs or for doctors. They're all at different levels. Some of them are total bogus. Some of them are potential hiccups. And each one that we get, we have to then determine what's the next best step for that particular person. And I think Michael, we just got one today, and it was just an angry patient on a refund, So it just really is all across the board as it relates to what it could be. And so sometimes, again, it's pretty easy to get rid of. Other times we have a great case out of Oregon where you had to do a lot of mending to put the physician in the right position so that when he finally did go in front of the boards, he was compliant.
Yeah, and I'd add to that if you are interested in being investigated, one thing you can do is have a no refund policy. Yes. Patients always turn people in when they don't get a refund.
Wow.
If you're interested in being investigated, that's a real.
That's me. Everybody's got it right.
Yes, it sounds exciting.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so we talked about some really good things, and I want to kind of wrap this up and move on. But so we talked about the ownership, right? Who can own a medical aesthetic practice? We talked about the structure of what that needs to look like, the MSO and the MSA. We talked about who can perform what. And so those would be obviously for the people wanting to start a practice.
Yeah.
And they would retain you and walk us through sort of that process. And then someone just asked us this yesterday, part of one of our Apex clients, and she's a solopreneur, an NP in Scottsdale. And when we think about like our standard operating procedures or these documents that a practice would have to have, are those, one, I want to talk about what those things are, and if you could outline that for the tribe listening, and number two, when they retain you, what does that scope of work look like?
Well, it varies. I would say this: we always, because there is. I'm going to try to answer this as if there is a one size fits all, because that's how you asked it. But there are variants, whether it's by state or just the personality of the people involved and their risk tolerance. The first thing we're going to deal with is their corporate structure and making sure they're set up, whether it's the MSO model or just forming a professional entity that they need in their particular state. And, that's a fundamental. Structurally, how are you set up? And then the secondary thing is, okay, how are you set up to deal with the patient risk? So do you have a compliant EMR, HIPAA compliant EMR set up? Do you have a HIPAA compliance plan and all of the patient intake documents ready to go? And sometimes clients have those already. They've gotten them, or they've had them because of a prior job. And sometimes we help with that. And then the third thing is to deal with the employee situation. How are you going to be staffed? Do you need employment agreements? Do you need an employee handbook? And really, to get started, that's what you need, is to deal with. Sometimes people don't start with employees, and you don't need that kind of component to it. You're always going to need something to make sure you're well suited with the patients, and you always need to be structurally set up correctly. But it can get more complicated if they have more sophisticated or aggressive plans, but that's the general startup. I don't know if you...
Yeah, and that's fair assessment. And then you can keep adding layers to that. So, I'm a facility and I have one location. So obviously you have to figure out, what does your lease look like? What type of insurance do you have for that facility? Or you start extending out. Well, I want to do mobile. And so as I'm doing mobile, I'm sending people out and about. Well, what are your policies and processes that you have in place to make sure that as the medication is being moved around, it's accounted for? Is being kept compliantly? Do you have the right insurance that protects you as an owner, that someone's out there doing something? Are you clearing them properly? So that, depending on which direction that particular practice is going in. So going back to your nurse practitioner, if she's by herself, the number of things that she needs to get going is be less. Then she says, I'm by myself, but I'm adding 10 people in the next 2 weeks. Well, that changes everything. So that starts going where Michael was going, the layers of different things. And of course, and I think the most important thing I think that you're looking for here, Terry, and your audience is, these are all there to protect you, the owner. And that's either the legal document itself, the protocols themselves, and the insurance itself.
And I just add, I should have expanded on this. When you're talking about the structure piece of it, if there's two owners or more involved, dealing with that relationship is very important in the front end, and making sure everyone's on the same page. Or you're going to have a business divorce, and it's a bet the business type situation. Whenever founders break up, usually it's a sinking ship.
Yeah.
No, thank you guys. And I think it's important. I think, again, as we're talking about this ecosystem, and people will always say, God, Terry, do I need all these things? And I'm like, well, if you are making that conscious decision to start a medical aesthetic practice, you're taking the risk. You want to be an entrepreneur and you have to do it right. And I think for them to know what the fundamental aspects are so that they aren't wasting time and money and looking at your services or what it takes to be again, within legal and compliance, there's a cost associated to that. But again, you just said it's minimizing risk so that they can run a successful practice. Moving on toward this hot topic that you were just talking about at ASAPs for, a million hours, this whole private equity boost. What is going on?
Well, I think, we could even take an even bigger step back. And I think, Terry, I can't remember if you attend this also, but, we attended a boot camp as it relates to private equity in Vegas. And there was a lot of interested people as to what's going in the aesthetic society. And I had the pleasure of being on stage. Michael did too with private equity. And there are 3 different firms there, and they all said the same thing. We have a lot of dry powder. I mean, they got a lot of money. So it's sitting on the sideline. They are ready to deploy it as fast as they can. And they are looking for the right fit and the right practices. And all those practices they're looking at right now have to be fully compliant, because that makes them too nervous to go to a place that's not right. They'll just move on to the next one. And so that's the kind of the super high level as to what's going on. And I know Michael and I have had just an enormous number of phone calls, either from private equity groups who are trying to get into the market, are in the market now, or from people who are saying, especially with plastic surgeons who 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years ago never would have thought ever to sell to private equity, who are now getting calls all the time about selling to private equity. And before we get into the legal piece, I want to see your thoughts too on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, again, talking broadly, especially as it relates to the medical aesthetic space, and I'll exclude dermatology for a moment, because dermatology has been pretty advanced with private equity for a number of years. But for medical spas and plastic surgery and other, facial plastics, et cetera, you haven't seen as much private equity activity. Mm-hmm. During COVID, we started getting interested calls from people with money saying, hey, we're exploring this. We have this idea of doing a bunch of roll-ups. Then we started getting doctors that were calling us. And now, just to get the flavor, I bet a day doesn't go by that we're not talking with someone. I know yesterday I was talking with private equity. Yeah. I've gotten a call today from a physician who wants to learn about it. And that's pretty much an example of our day to day.
And to add to that it was about 2 years ago is when the call started. Now I feel like, so our firm, as we were talking earlier, we do a lot of M&A, merger and acquisitions in this space. I don't know how many deals we have open right now that are private equity backed, either buying or working with private equity, and the acquisitions of med spas or derm or plastic is very high right now, or just our firm touching on a daily basis too. So we're getting the phone call saying, is it going on? The answer is yes, and that it's actively happening. It was, I'd say 2 years ago when the phone call started, it was kicking the tires. They're past kicking the tires now. They're in acquisition mode.
So, Brad, I know you mentioned these private equity have, boatloads of money. What prompt, and of course we all know this industry continues to grow at double digits, but what is prompting private equity to care about this space so much right now?
Well, a couple things. Number one, on the med spa piece, they have figured out a formula that they believe is very repeatable. And so, if you have the processes in place, you have the team in place, you've secured all those elements of it. The private equity think on the non-invasive side, they know how to repeat that. They know how to grow it. They want to acquire the 1 and 2 shop persons, build it up bigger, and obviously down the road, probably try to resell it again. So we can talk about the purchase side another time, or if we have more time. But that's on the non-invasive side. On the plastic side, it's the same thing now. They're just trying to figure out how to come up with the right formula and then grow it with multiple different practices, again, to grow it. As you know, Terry, most plastics are 1 or 2 person shops. They tend to play by themselves really well, but they don't like to play in bigger groups. And I think with the conversations that we've had is these groups are coming in, try to pull a whole bunch together, again, grow it to be a bigger group and then resell it down the road.
So what are they looking for? Just this was such a great timing to have this podcast because I had about 3 calls yesterday, and some of the things are above my pay grade, which is why you're here. What are they looking for on the? So it sounds like they're not looking for distress; they're looking for profitable practices. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
Michael has a great answer for this.
Yeah, I mean they're and I don't know if I'm going to say what you're thinking, but they're looking for a lot of different things. So some are looking for, kind of using the real estate analogy, like the anchor tenant, like they're looking for the big name to give them credibility and that they can start a market around. And so that may be someone that's getting close to retirement, but it's a big name, or not. They're going to pay more the longer you're planning to stay around if you're willing to stay around. And I mean, it's all about scale. Like whether you're in plastic surgery or medical spas, almost everyone is what would be considered a small business. And private equity traditionally doesn't mess with small businesses. That they've been trying to figure out how to get into this space. And so they are. And so now they're trying to just do a bunch of acquisitions and probably going to also mix in starting their own up once they get some momentum behind it. And they're trying to get big. And then when they have scale, that's when the real big multiples come in a later exit, 5 years down the line. And their big selling point to the practices is, yes, we're going to pay you X now. And I can talk about that, what X is. But we really want you to reinvest 25 to 30% into us. And 5 years from now, we're going to get, a
much bigger
15 times multiple or something like that.
Okay. And that's interesting because that was one of the questions. Okay. So then what about profit margins? What kind of margins are they looking at? What kind of multiples are they paying out?
So there's a little bit of variability. So if you think about, they use this fancy term called EBITDA. But really what you're looking at is if you can distill down to the free cash flow of the business. So they're trying to iron out, one-time expenses. If you've got a country club membership, all that kind of stuff to get to some number that would be, the profit distributions that they could predict on. And in these first phase acquisitions, the most common on the surgical side, particularly paying 1 to 5 times that, depending on. So it's a surgeon that's 70 that's ready to walk out the door. They're probably going to get acquired closer to the 1, and on up to 5, and it goes up from there. I have clients that are in their early 50s that have thriving practices that are getting offered 8.5 times, and that's like unheard of historically. But that's the whole trying to get the anchor tenant strategy that goes with that.
And some of that also, for your audience to understand, we're talking about this on the surgical side. Some of these surgeons have very robust med spas and ancillaries inside of it. So it's not just I'm buying into the surgical side, because a lot of these surgeons, as Michael is referencing, they're slowing down their surgical, but what the private equity is betting on is good name, well respected. They have the non-invasive side that's clicking already. We can get a young buck in there to work in this program and continue with the growth model. And to Michael's point, though, we want to carry you with us. Here, we'll give you some cash now, right? There'll be some money that gets paid to you, but we want you to roll the entire value of that. Roll a piece of the value that we're giving you into this other company. We want you to stay around and help this thing grow and become bigger. And then the next time we sell, it's be a much bigger piece for you, the initial person through the door. So
which, by the way, to make this all full circle, what you're rolling that 30% or 25% into is an MSO.
Yeah.
What we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I want to be clear, and I won't say who, but I had a couple calls again, like I said, this past week, and I think you just said it. Two questions I have. If the practice's name, a surgical practice, is in the name of the person,
yeah,
does that hurt or affect the possible acquisition? because it's that. No, it
Not
doesn't.
Historically, we would say yes. And I would agree 100% with what Brad just said, which is we're not seeing that.
Yeah, because what they're doing is right now is they are buying up a couple of different name brands, and eventually they probably will then bring it as a rebranding down the road. But what happens is, if you think about going back to the money's all eventually flowing up to the mothership, that has the value. So we talked about Durham, but DSO, dental support organizations, have been doing this for a long, long time. Well, they'll hit a region, they keep the name that the area, they know that name, they'll build upon that name, but it's all the money is being pulled out to a dental support organization. And so they're still building up the overall value in the big mothership, or in this case, as Michael said, the larger MSO.
Okay, so back to this last question. What's in it for the doctor? And what I think I hear you saying is that, they are running this successful practice. They're probably getting some payout now, able to reinvest in the business. And so would be fair to say what's in it for them? Yeah,
I think there's a couple different takeaways for the physicians, or just the entrepreneur in general. Is the first big takeaway is, for a long, long time, the talk in the locker room was your practice is worthless. When you retire, you get nothing. Or you can only sell your practice to another doctor, and that's it, which then sometimes they felt like it was worthless, right? So that's the first big takeaway, is that in the aesthetic market right now, if your practice is in the right spot right now, private equity, these entrepreneurs are interested in looking at it. I think that's the big takeaway I think we can give your audience on that piece. And I think the other piece that is you, the physician, if that's, if we're talking about them, or again, if it's a PA or nurse practitioner, you have to be willing to work for someone else. And so that's Michael often talks about the plan A and plan B when it comes to your retirement and kind of planning out your process. If you want to sell for a top dollar, that means you're staying for a while to work. If you want to retire and move to Bora Bora, you're going to get the low end of the scale. And so those are the kind of the big takeaways I can tell you. And there's, again, we could probably spend 20 minutes on pros and cons, but I know Michael has some good talking points there too.
I'm going to say the same thing Brad said, just kind of in my own words, which is, you say what's in it for them. Well, the reason why you would do it is as an exit plan. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's the right exit plan for a particular practice, but it has the potential to yield the highest return on the practice that you built, because you have this market that's being created out there that is, new and unique. And like Brad said, we could spend the next 20 minutes going through the pros and cons and really lining up whether, it's the right fit for someone who has been running their own ship for their entire career.
Yeah. And I will add one more thing to that, Terry. It's personal, right? We, the attorneys, we can walk you through the legal factors that you have to go through with the LOI phase or the due diligence phase, the definitive agreements. That's our job, to kind of walk you through the same risk that Michael was talking about earlier about how can we minimize risk. That's, I'm not saying it's easy, but that's what we do. Ultimately, though, you, the owner, the decision maker, is going to have to make, am I okay with this? Am I okay with that? And there's a lot of give and take in this process. And, we always talk about this when we talk about M&A. There's a process that goes through it. You have to trust the process. You have to follow the process. There are no shortcuts. If you want to take the shortcuts, you're not going to get a good deal. And more importantly, you're going to get burned on the backside of that.
Michael, do you guys do any consulting? I mean, I think for a lot of physicians or a lot of entrepreneurs, right, perhaps considering this option and don't understand the fundamentals or all of the aspects that are necessary, or even, if is it the right PE firm, and is it the right, before they retain you, is that something that you guys do?
Yeah. I mean, it's a natural benefit of hiring us as your attorneys, is that we have such depth in this industry that's part of it. So there is a heavy, especially for Brad and I, the strategy side of anything they're doing is going to be mixed with a lot of our experiences in this industry. So yes, I think that's a part of it.
Yeah. And Terry, you've been in our office before. So as you've seen, we have a whiteboard on our walls, and they're physically in our office or they're coming via Zoom. part of that consulting is mapping it out on that board with them as to here are your options, so you can visually see here's option 1, here's option 2, here's option 3. And so that's, again, helping them build their platform of the choices they have in front of them. And then as we dive deeper, as Michael was saying, we just keep kind of narrowing the scope for them. But yeah, we are lawyers, but that, you ask consulting, it is the advising side of it. That's where you have to start at the highest level. And then we obviously, the details matter with anything. It's a legal document.
I love this. This was such a beneficial podcast. Are there any kind of lasting final words before we talk about where people can find you as it relates to, sort of wrapping up? This podcast was about the life cycle of an aesthetic practice. And I know we could do a series on what this really entails and what it means from, again, the things we discussed, the ownership, the structure, the services, the medical practice, of medicine. And then as it relates to exiting out, and there's so many things in between, what are maybe the top, 3 to 5 things, whether someone is considering starting up and or exiting, that they just must do. It's a must. They can't overlook it to make sure that they are, successful.
I'll start with this. If someone's at the phase of saying, I'm interested, I'd like to learn more, I would encourage them to go to our podcast, because we have a lot of topic specific, heavier legal, mostly built around a story. That's the premise of our podcast. It's the Legal 1, 2, 3s with ByrdAdatto. That we've had this one guest before named Terry Ross. She was amazing. And
I love her.
Yes, she's great.
She's a 2-time Terry.
But that's a good education resource. And then if they're ready to, really dig in, go to our website. There's a contact us form on there, and schedule a consult and tell us you came to us from Terry, and we'll waive our normal consult fee and be happy to get connected and learn a little bit more in that introductory call about what they have going on, and help, kind of educate on what they might need.
And I think this goes back to what something you asked at the very beginning of this. And just because someone else is doing it that way does not mean it's right. Michael and I, again, have been at this long enough that unfortunately I've had clients who were the boards decide to make them the example, and everyone else was doing it that way. And then they said, wait, what's going on here? Oh, no, this is not how we can. We're going to put this person out there so everyone knows that we don't like it this way. And so that's the piece to be very mindful of, that if, a lot of you in the Terry world, you worked really dang hard to get that business up and running. You probably worked really hard for your license that you have. Our job as attorneys is not to tell you right from wrong. Our job is to tell you the risk associated with whatever you're doing. Then you get to choose whether or not you want to continue down that path. But I always like to at least put our clients in the best position to have eyes wide open to know what those risks are. And as Michael has heard me say a million times, everyone has different risk tolerance. Some people are terrified to step out of a shower in the morning. Other people jump out of a perfectly good airplane. So it's, they're just different tolerances. Our job is at least walk you through those.
Well, God, thank you guys so much. And I think, again, this was such a great segue, because what we're doing here at Apex Platform, and, where Terry Ross Consulting shifted, is that we're very, very excited. We have been having and launched a pilot program, which is our new practice development program. We have taken on 4 clients that is going successfully. We're in the 10th week. We're opening up a new practice development course that'll run 21 weeks. And really that is going to help people that are stuck, considering opening, not knowing where to go, to help reduce them, save time and money, so that they can work with experts, including yourself, in what it takes to start a practice. And so having you guys on at this most pivotal time, because you are going to be instrumental in our new course. And again, I want to thank you so much for being longtime friends of mine, experts in the space, and for our tribe. I really do value their work, and we always want to provide the best for you so that you are protected and minimizing risk and be set up for success. So as you guys know, Terry's tribe, anybody part of Apex does get a complimentary call. I would take advantage. I want to call them just for free myself. And so Michael and Brad, again, with ByrdAdatto, where can they, I know you gave us the podcast. This will all be, guys, in the show notes. So don't worry about that. But where can people, what's the website? Where's the best way that they can find you? And then certainly you guys can always DM or contact me, and I will put you in contact with them as well.
So Michael's cell phone is 215. Our website's probably the best place to find us at ByrdAdatto.com. As you said, it'll be in the notes, and in there you can look at all the different ways we charge our clients. You can look at all our blogs that we have. We have access to our podcasts. All that will be on our website. And hopefully, again, there's also asking for a consult button that you can press. So all the things that you need, just go to ByrdAdatto, ByrdAdatto.com, and we can hopefully be a resource for the Terry tribe.
You want to take advantage of that, guys. Michael and Brad, thank you again so much. And for my listeners, thank you for subscribing, for listening. Please also listen to their podcast. It's very advantageous with valuable information. And this is what we're here for, to make sure that we provide the best care with the most, highly level of experts in the field. So if this resonated with you, or if you are stuck in this space, whether you're considering starting or exiting, I encourage you to, again, reach out to us at apexplatform.com. Learn about our new program that we're launching on June 10th, taking on 10 people, and more importantly, where you can find Michael and Brad. So thank you guys so much, and stay tuned for the next episode of In Touch with Terry. Ciao.
Thanks for listening to In Touch with Terry. We invite you to schedule a discovery call with our Apex team. The link to apexplatform.com can be found in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of In Touch with Terry.